Welcome to Address the Harm podcast. I'm Leah Brown, FRSA, founder of the Wayfinders Group and architect of the Coalition for Institutional Accountability. Please be aware that this podcast discusses difficult topics, including violence, abuse, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. This podcast centres the voices that institutions in Britain work hardest to silence: survivors of institutional harm. New polling shows 53% of Britons believe preventing future harm matters most when institutions cause damage, and yet our systems are designed for crisis management, not prevention. 62% of the British public believe survivors should be involved in institutional responses, and yet they're systematically excluded. From NHS failures to police cover-ups, survivors have become unwilling experts in institutional failure. They know what went wrong, why it keeps happening, and how to stop it. And yet institutions rarely ask them. But on Address the Harm podcast, we do. Survivors share not just their stories, but their blueprint for prevention. Because when institutions finally listen to those they failed, that's when real accountability becomes possible. It's time to address the harm. Today, I'm joined by Andy Evans, chair of Tainted Blood and survivor of the infected blood scandal. Andy was infected with HIV and hepatitis C at the age of 5 through contaminated haemophilia treatment provided by the NHS. He's one of the few to survive the 42 years since. In 2006, he co-founded Tainted Blood with the late Gareth Lewis to advocate for the more than 30,000 people infected by contaminated blood products in the 1970s and 1980s. About 3,000 people have since died. The inquiry report came in May 2024. Rishi Sunak called it a day of shame for the British state. Documentary evidence was deliberately destroyed. Compensation is finally being paid, up to £2 million for some survivors. Well, Andy, welcome to the Address the Harm podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here, Leah. Thank you for having me on.
I wonder, to start, if you might be able to tell those who aren't familiar with your story, what is the institutional harm that you have experienced?
So I'm a victim of the infected blood scandal, which I think probably most people have heard of, although we still come across people that never have, which is part of the institutional harm that we have experienced, because the subject matter has historically been seen as dirty or not something that needs to be exposed to the public, and so we've had real difficulty in getting traction for the campaign. So just to briefly explain what happened to people, in the late 70s and early 80s, the government was buying in contaminated blood products, and these were being used to treat haemophiliacs in the main. Haemophiliacs are people without a specific clotting order in their clotting factor in their blood, which meant that they would bleed internally, mainly into organs, but mostly into joints. They were treated originally with whole blood, then it was fresh frozen plasma, then it was something called cryoprecipitate, which is a slightly more concentrated version of the plasma, which helped people. And then eventually a new wonder product came out called Factor 8. And Factor 8 was a very concentrated version of the piece of our blood which was missing. And that was reconstituted into an injectable solution, and we've injected it, and that would help us to control any internal bleeds, any also external bleeds, things like nosebleeds and whatnot that we would find difficult to stop. And during the course of purchasing these products, we were not self-sufficient in the UK, and so they had to be outsourced to companies in the United States who were paying their donors to give blood. And as a result, the types of people that were queuing up to give their blood and to receive payment for it often tended to be those who were kind of on the down and out side of life. So we're talking Skid Row, drug users, prostitutes. All these people had one factor in common, and that was that they were more likely to be carrying viruses. And so these viruses found their way into the blood products that haemophiliacs were using to treat themselves. And the UK government, despite warnings from medical doctors and scientists in the US, that there was a problem with viruses being transmitted in these blood, continued to buy them up and to use them on haemophiliacs without warning them that there were any kinds of problems with them. And so in the 70s, most haemophiliacs were exposed to hepatitis B. And then as time went on, the new gay plague, as it was known back in the day, turned out to be HIV and AIDS, was found in the blood, and 1,248 people in the UK were given HIV through their haemophilia treatment. And then later on, when it was identified and we were able to test for it, around about 4,800 people were also infected with the hepatitis C virus, including all of those who had previously contracted HIV. In my case, I was infected in 1983 with HIV, possibly from my first treatment in 1978 or so with hepatitis C. When I had HIV, I was 5 years old. And so it's very much defined my entire existence. So not only coping with haemophilia treatment, the restrictions that brought, but also then having to cope with literal death sentences that were, as we've since discovered, knowingly injected into the arms of haemophiliacs. And so, the harm really came from several places. It came from the pharmaceutical companies in the United States originally. It then came from the commissioning purchasing bodies from the government and the NHS, who clearly knew more about the risks to these products than we did. Then it came from haemophilia doctors in the NHS, so consultants mainly, who were in many cases schmoozed and bribed by the pharmaceutical companies to buy their products. Later on, the NHS staff were also culpable for not explaining to people that they had contracted these viruses and keeping them secret. And so that the older members of the community, people who were married or in sexual relationships, actually passed some of these viruses on to their partners, many of whom have since died. They ran experiments on infectivity trials. So they were using children, particularly in the, across the UK, but in particular, the one example is Treloar's School, where many haemophiliacs went, and all were used to test infectivity of the various products that were coming across from the United States. And then there was a decades-long, I guess you would call it, closing of the ranks. It has been called a cover-up. Just a lack of admission that this was a preventable tragedy, and that became a scandal, until we finally, after 40 years of campaigning, managed to get a public inquiry into the infected blood scandal in 2017. That reported in 2024, and now we are once again facing difficulties trying to get reparations for the victims, even now that the truth has come out and this was discovered to not be an accident, as we thought all along.
Thousands of people have lost their life as a result of this scandal. And we will come on to the preventative nature of the scandal in a minute. But you're obviously one of the few to survive. So what does that survivorship carry with it? How does it feel to still be here when so many others aren't?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a common theme when within the scandal, so many people are impacted. It's certainly in the case of HIV, we're down to about 20% of survivors. Yeah, so around about 4/5 of us with HIV are now dead. For me, it's carried a great sense of responsibility because these are people that I've met over the years and who are no longer with us. But as a person with feelings, it's obviously there's a huge sense of survivor's guilt there as well, because I managed to reach the grand old age of 48, having survived when so many didn't make it past childhood. It's a huge responsibility that I feel to try to achieve some kind of justice for them and for the people that they've left behind, their families. It's really difficult, and in a way, it's essential to try to distance yourself in the everyday from the reality of it, and try to become at least desensitized to the absolute horror that the community has been through. Otherwise, I don't think we'd be able to get any work done and make progress on this at all.
When did you first realise that this wasn't just a tragic accident, that it was preventable and that warnings were being ignored?
Before I set up the group Tainted Blood, there were many other individuals and campaign groups who had looked into this. I was still quite young. And so anything that I've done and the group in Tainted Blood have done really is a result of standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before. Unfortunately, many of those people are no longer with us, but they laid the groundwork. They were the ones that came up with the notion that this potentially could have been avoided, that potentially it was not an accident, and the decisions were made which were in the interests of money rather than victims and people. And so upon hearing that, I very quickly stopped feeling sorry for myself and started to get angry about it. And did my own research and met up with other people who had done, the groundwork and who were investigating further. We came up with a lot of documentation. We actually laid it all out online in what we call the Tainted Blood timeline, which details every step of the way. The documentation includes letters which describe the mentality of the people who are making the decisions. It includes warning letters from eminent physicians in the United States who are warning that the drug companies were acting unscrupulously and that these viruses will be present in the blood supply. That when they found out about it, they did not stop production. In fact, they changed the process in the United States so that it could not be sold there, and still continue to export the products across the world, including to the UK. We've just uncovered so much about the original scandal, which has then been compounded by freedom of information requests, which show why the government had decided that they wanted to keep this under wraps and to not broach the topic of compensation for victims simply because it would cost too much. The scandal was far too big. So it's been systemic denial and refusal to acknowledge and intentional obfuscation and cover up really since the very beginning. It's a catalogue of errors, really.
So you set up Tainted Blood in 2006, and you didn't get the
Yes.
inquiry report until 2024. So you spent 18 years campaigning just to get this timeline to be acknowledged and to get recompense. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about why it took that long and how it felt to get that statement from the then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, after the inquiry was published?
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to before, it's really difficult to gain any kind of traction. Well, first of all, with the public, which is hugely important if you want to achieve any kind of justice, because pressure has to come from the public in order for the government to do anything on any scandal. We know that. HIV and AIDS were stigmatized heavily back in the 1980s. I remember being extremely scared seeing the the adverts voiced by John Hurt with the gravestones falling. People did not want to talk about it. If they did talk about it, it was with tones of disgust. It's something that, it is really difficult to get any kind of public sympathy for. When hepatitis C came along, it was a very similar story, maybe not quite as severe as HIV and AIDS. But I think the stigma and the public perception of these diseases certainly assisted the government in being able to keep everything concealed, not only because people were afraid to stand up and talk about their own situations for fear of retribution, um, but also it's just seen as a generally taboo topic. It's gotten better recently. It's not completely faded from the public consciousness. HIV and AIDS in the UK is still stigmatized to a degree, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 80s and 90s. So that's, I think, is part of the reason that the progression of the stigmatization of the viruses has lessened, and so now people are more willing to understand and talk about it. But I think that that notion that this scandal is just far too massive to compensate was a driving force, along with the self-protection that ministers, the health service, civil servants felt all the way along. And that seemed to be the culture throughout all of those institutions, that self-preservation was the overriding principle, far more so than the truth. And
Yeah. So just on self-protection, because one of the things we did in our white paper that was recently published was examine the infected blood scandal apology in great detail. And whilst it touched on acknowledgement and apology and accountability and amends, there's actually no individual accountability. So like nobody has been fired for the decisions that were made. No one is still in the firing line historically, and there's no present accountability for what has happened or continues to happen. How does that feel as a survivor? And is this kind of institutional apology enough if individuals aren't held responsible?
I mean, don't get me wrong, the apology after the inquiry reported, I felt it was meaningful, and it was detailed. They knew what they were apologising for, Rishi Sunak and all the other parties that have contributed to this scandal over the years. They laid it out in detail, which we were grateful for, because nobody's ever even come close to doing that before. Having said that, the inquiry itself had limited powers in terms of culpability and criminal accusations, if you like. So we always knew that it was going to take more in order to bring individuals to account. And the government were never going to do that voluntarily. Now, we know that there has been the instigation, or the request at least, for a criminal investigation into the Tainted Blood scandal, including who, and we have our own ideas about, who would be most culpable within this, about who made these decisions, who advised ministers to say the things that they were saying, and who continued to buy these products. But I think it's a limitation of statutory inquiries that they can't incorporate that into their scope, because, yes, the apology was meaningful, but it doesn't actually hold anybody accountable. All it does is compel the government to acknowledge its mistakes in a far wider context than would give many people the justice and the retribution, I suppose, for the terrible decisions and the lives lost for those decisions that people have made. It's something that I think is very close to a lot of people's hearts. They would like to see people taken to court and quizzed about why they did what they did, and punished for it if it's found out that they were culpable for the things that we think they were. But all we know so far is that when the criminal investigation was requested, it was put on a shelf somewhere. We don't know. We haven't got any progress as far as that's concerned. We keep chasing it up, but once again, it's another battle that we're going to have to hold their feet to the fire on.
One of the challenges of incomplete justice is where a compensation scheme has been announced and partially awarded. Walk us through the calculation of the entitlement for victims and how that is calculated to compensate for such an extended period of time of suffering.
I think there are a couple of points to make on this. One, the compensation that people are now entitled to is based upon the losses that they have incurred, rather than any kind of acknowledgement that this was a wrongdoing. There's no punitive measures in there whatsoever. So the calculations are very coldly based on what the government believes the average financial loss of people, over how much they had to pay for care, even up to the date of death. There are things in there that are compensated for negligibly, such as autonomy, injury, social impact. But most of it is just a cold calculation about what people would have been able to do had they not been infected, rather than, an accountability for the actions that led them there in the first place. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is really, when it comes to compensation of a scandal like this, and many of the other scandals that we know of, the money is never, ever going to be enough. It will never give people back the person that they lost. It will never give those who are still alive the health that they have missed, the opportunities in life that they would have enjoyed. Nothing will do that. The only thing that compensation can do, well, first of all, it's an acknowledgement. It's a token of justice. It's the admission, really, that wrongs had been done and that they should not have been done, and that their suffering has been acknowledged. The very least compensation can do is to allow those who remain to try to gain some semblance of life back for as much time as they have left. And none of us know how long we have left. We're still, infected victims are still dying at the rate of 2 a week. We're talking about the affected as well, who are now elderly, especially parents of children who died back in the early 80s, who don't know how much life they have left, who are too old probably to, enjoy a large sum of money should it come along. So for them, the acknowledgement and the I suppose semblance, the notion of justice that compensation brings is enough. But as I say, any figure would be too little for the suffering and the impact that this has had on the community.
When we talk about communities affected by a scandal like this, it is very clear that the thing that is most broken is trust. Trust in doctors, trust in government, trust in people who have an obligation to citizens' health, welfare, and well-being. How do you rebuild trust after that level of betrayal?
This is a really difficult issue for most of the victims of this scandal, not least because the way that this has impacted us, the institutions that were involved, particularly the National Health Service, we rely on in order to treat the conditions that we were given, and we have no choice in that matter. We have to go to, in effect, our abusers in order to be able to receive treatment, and then we have to go to another set of abusers, i.e. the government, in order to get any kind of semblance of justice. And both of those institutions have failed us very badly. The government still continues to fail us to this day. And that's so difficult for people to get their heads around. And as a result, we've seen people not seek the treatment that they require because they simply don't trust the medical establishment anymore. They don't trust doctors. Some of them can't even go to a hospital because it's too re-traumatizing for them. So rebuilding trust is less of a hill, more of a mountain. And the government at the moment does not have the answers that it needs in order to do that. It's committed that it wants to rebuild trust. I'm skeptical that that's ever truly possible in these circumstances. But if it were to be possible, then I really don't think they're going the right way about it so far. The compensation scheme, the memorialisation, all of the recommendations from the inquiry, the constant consultations, the revisiting of issues, the re-traumatising of the community at every opportunity. We're talking possibly up until 2029 before most people are paid compensation. All of these things do not for trust make. So it's another constant battle that we have to deal with these people on a daily basis, who proclaim that they want to build trust and then their actions say completely differently.
You're listening to the Address the Harm podcast with Andy Evans. We're going to have a short ad break.
A woman was raped? No, a man raped a woman. The Right Words campaign asks journalists, institutions, social media, and the public to change the language. Join us at therightwordsproject.org.
You're listening to the Address the Harm podcast with Andy Evans. Let's dive back into the conversation. Andy, if we go back to the inquiry where clear recommendations were made. So we've got the compensation, we've got the public memorials, we've got the improvements in health and government processes. And yet the justice desired as a result of the inquiry remains incomplete. If you could design a response to this harm that is continuing, that clearly goes beyond compensation, what would that include? What would that look like?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, if I could build a time machine, going back and changing those decisions would be the ultimate objective, I think. It's really, really difficult to know. I mean, it's a hard question to answer because, the recommendations from the inquiry, I think, said pretty much everything that needs to happen in order to make the best of the situation as it currently is. And the situation as it currently is far from ideal. It's 40 years on from the original infections. So much time has passed. So many people have died. It will never be the true justice that perhaps was possible, back in the late 80s or even early 90s when something could have been done about this. My take on it is this: the inquiry has been the best asset that we've ever had in this campaign. From the very beginning, Sir Brian Langstaff made it perfectly clear that he was going to put people front and centre. As a result of that, many people, hundreds of people, have managed to tell their stories, to gain some sort of catharsis and ownership of what's happened to them. And that in itself has helped people to feel that their losses and their trauma have been recognised. And that was from a completely different source to the people that ought to have been dealing with this for such a long time, i.e. the government. And the inquiry really listened, and it brought the people to give testimony that it needed to, that we needed to hear from, so far as it could, because such a long time has passed that many of the people that we needed to hear from are either dead or too frail to give evidence. But given, its time frame reference and the powers that it had, it did a great job of holding people to account in the best way that it could. So we're confident, I think, in general, that the inquiry's recommendations, were they to be implemented in full, in a compassionate manner, even, might I say, a generous manner, looking at things in the true sense of attempting to obtain justice for people, which is what the government really ought to be thinking about right now, rather than closing ranks again and saving money. If they were carried out in full, then I think that would be most of the way towards the justice that people feel that they need. And I think if that were to happen, it might be time for me to hang up my campaigning shoes and walk away, but we're certainly not there yet.
One of the things the inquiry recommended was independent oversight. How much would that have helped in the outworking of those recommendations and ensuring that each of those was properly adopted?
Oh, hugely. Every single recommendation, although accepted in principle by the government, still means that we need to battle to have them enacted, because they just, I don't know what happens once they enter the big machine of the Houses of Parliament, but I don't know whether they get filed to the bottom of a big stack of papers or what, but it's up to us, the victims, and it shouldn't be up to us, the victims, to keep pressing and looking for updates on the progress of each of these recommendations. Compensation has been one thing, and it's been probably the most important thing since it was announced the day after the inquiry, because that's really important to get done and will help more people move on with their lives. But the other things, are just as important in the long run. We need that memorialization. We need the oversight. We need the groundbreaking recommendation that the government, puts on itself this duty of candour, not only within the parliamentary machine itself, but within the civil service. And it had all these things been in place before the inquiry reported, I think we'd be much, much further down the line than we are now. When it comes to this kind of scandal, it seems to take such a long time for the wheels to turn and for anything to be addressed. And I think we really need some sort of oversight body to keep pressing on these issues on our behalf, because it should not be up to the victims to keep doing this.
My question is this. You mentioned at the very beginning that the initial scandal was compounded by a further scandal, which was then compounded. How do we stop these scandals from emerging and reoccurring? What structural changes do you think are needed to prevent future scandals?
In terms of structure, I don't know whether there's a great deal that can be done. I think the ethos of the people who work within those structures needs to fundamentally change. As I mentioned before, the duty of candour would be a huge benefit to having things like this addressed earlier. The lack of self-preservation would have been a wonderful thing. If people hadn't decided to close ranks around, quite frankly, the lies that were being told just in order to preserve their positions as ministers, their jobs as civil servants. And I'm hoping, it's early days yet, but I'm hoping that the Hillsborough bill will accomplish some of those things. But a bill and laws can only do so much. They need to be enforced, and they need to have people looking to make sure that they're enforced. And that's where I think an oversight body would have been an excellent thing to have back in the day, because at least there would have been somebody to go to say, look, we feel that something was done wrongly here. We don't know if it was an accident. We don't know, whether it was intentional, but it needs investigating. But there's nobody to turn to. And that's why it's taken victims, frightened victims, people who are extremely ill, people who are dying. That's why it's taken us 40 years to get to this point. And now we are 40 years on. The death toll is immense. The suffering of bereaved family members is off the charts. People are still continuing to die. And had we had anything in those early days that we could have pointed to and said, look, we need your help, it might have prevented a lot of the tragedy within this scandal happening, but it also may have prevented other scandals from happening in the future, simply because there was that fear of breaking the rules there. Another thing that I think needs to happen is that when scandals like this happen and they are proved to be intentional or at least not an accident, and people are found to have made mistakes, we really need culpability. We really need those people to answer for what is in effect a crime for the things that they did. And that has to be there to act as a deterrent for future scandals as well. It's a simply enough thing, but I think there is still that ethos of closing ranks and protecting the internal machinery of the government. And while we have that, I don't see prosecutions within the machine come about.
It strikes me that you have something to say to other survivors fighting institutional harms right now. So maybe those fighting other negligence claims in the NHS or police cover-ups or issues in care homes. What have you learned in your campaigning that might help them? What do you wish you'd known at the beginning of this fight?
Public perception is everything. Not particularly from our scandal, but when the post office scandal drama came out, I think that infinitely helped because people started talking about it. You started hearing about comparisons between the post office and Infected Blood, or the post office and Grenfell. What's different about our scandal, which might not be relevant to others, is that it's played out over such a long period of time, whereas most other scandals you can probably pinpoint a time and date where decisions. Let's take Grenfell, for example. People were told to stay in their apartments when really they should have been evacuating. That's fairly simple. You can pinpoint it, you can visualize it. Something like the Infected Blood scandal, and to some extent the post office scandal, are more nebulous than that because they happened over such a long period of time. It takes something like the drama for the Horizon scandal to focus people's minds and to get them to fully understand it. And having people fully understand it is crucial, and have people believe it as well, because for such a long time we were cast aside as conspiracy theorists, that this couldn't happen in the United Kingdom, that we were all raving lunatics and we should go and just enjoy whatever life we had left and be grateful for it. Having the validation and the vindication that the inquiry brought was such a boost to everybody within the community. But if you can achieve that through other means, be that through the media, the drama, documentaries, forcing the public to take a good hard look at the facts, I think that in many cases turns the tide. You need to have the publicity, you need to have the recognition, you need to have the understanding of the general public. And only with that can you make progress. Do all your campaigning, write your letters, go on your marches, do everything you need to do, but make it as visible and as understandable as possible.
That's so helpful. What would you like to tell our listeners about your Tainted Blood campaign, or anything else about your experience that you haven't had a chance to share?
I'd like to mention a few people who were fundamental to Tainted Blood and to the campaigns that came before, who are no longer with us, but as I say, upon whose shoulders we stand. I'd like to mention in particular my good friends Gareth and Hayden Lewis, two haemophilia brothers from Wales, who set up an original campaign group, Birchgrove, in the 1990s before helping me with Tainted Blood. Both lost their lives in 2010. Darren Flack, Gary Kelly, Sue Gorman, Mike Doricott. So many people who have not lived to see the justice that we have mostly achieved by today, but who I hope are looking on with some kind of pride and relief that we've got there. And my biggest regret is that this took us such a long time. This is not what anybody wanted to do with their lives, but everybody who's played their part, they are all superhuman, in my opinion, and I'm just incredibly grateful to them.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful to you for your vulnerability, for your willingness to be so circumspect about a topic that is very, very challenging. Thank you for the ways that you've explained your journey and given encouragement to those who are trailblazing a similar path in other spaces. And thank you for your clarity on where the challenges sit with the government and with the inquiry process and with what it looks like to obtain justice for victims. It is hugely appreciated, and I hope that it will help us in our quest to create an office for institutional accountability and to rebuild trust in public services. So thank you for coming on Address the Harm.
My absolute pleasure, and of course, if there's anything I can help in in achieving your goals, then I'm more than happy to do so going forward.
Appreciate it. This is the Address the Harm podcast for the Coalition for Institutional Accountability. Andy Evans' story shows exactly why we need restorative principles embedded in the Nolan principles. Acknowledgement of harm, genuine apology, accountability that includes truth-telling, and amends that prioritise prevention over institutional self-protection. 40 years is too long to wait for justice. 3,000 deaths are too many. We need an independent office for institutional accountability with survivor-led oversight and real enforcement power, so that warnings are heeded, evidence isn't destroyed, and survivors don't have to fight for decades to be believed. You can be part of changing this system. Follow Address the Harm on social media, visit addresstheharm.org to support our campaign. Every donation funds our fight to stop institutions investigating themselves. Why not share this episode? Join our movement, because survivors' voices are the key to prevention. You've been listening to the Address the Harm podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Copyright 2025, production copyright, Leah Talks Limited, all rights reserved.